Sophie Miller had been preparing for this day for months, yet as she sat behind the wheel of the rental moving van, idling in front of the weathered brick house at the end of Willow Lane, she felt the familiar flutter of nerves rising in her chest. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried a faint promise of rain, though for now the sky remained an indifferent gray. Her hands, calloused from years of restoring antique furniture, gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. This house, her house now, had stood empty for nearly a decade, the subject of countless rumors and whispered stories in the neighborhood. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Arthur Langley, had passed without heirs, and for years the city had struggled to resolve the tangled mess of property rights, unpaid taxes, and zoning questions. Eventually, the house had become part of the city's historic restoration program, allowing qualified buyers to purchase and rehabilitate properties deemed of architectural or cultural value. Sophie, with her background in furniture restoration and historic preservation, had jumped at the chance. But knowing the history and seeing it in person were two different things. The house, a 3-story Victorian with faded maroon siding and intricate wrought iron railings, stood like a weary sentinel at the edge of the block. Most of the other homes on Willow Lane were mid-century modern boxes or sprawling ranch-style builds, renovated to within an inch of their lives by owners desperate to keep up with neighborhood trends. Sophie's house, in contrast, seemed caught in time, stubbornly holding on to its character. Ivy crept along its side, the front porch sagged slightly, and the large, arched windows bore the patina of years without care. Yet, beneath the neglect, Sophie saw the potential. A home with stories to tell, bones of craftsmanship, the kind of place that could, with patience and love, come alive again. She shut off the engine, exhaled slowly, and climbed out. The street was quiet, though she could feel eyes on her. Curtains twitched as she began unlocking the heavy front door. She had anticipated some curiosity from the neighbors. After all, the house had been empty for so long, and a steady stream of city inspectors, appraisers, and contractors had done little to quell the neighborhood's speculation. She'd heard some of the stories already, that the house was haunted, that it had been the site of unseemly activities, that squatters had once taken up residence. All nonsense, of course, but rumors had a way of lingering. Sophie was determined to let her work speak for itself. The first order of business was unloading the van. She had hired movers for the bulk of the heavy furniture, but the more delicate items, her antique tools, several rare pieces of restored woodwork, and personal boxes, she preferred to handle herself. Dressed in worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and work boots, she set to the task. The rhythm of moving, lifting, balancing, carrying, stacking, helped settle her nerves. She arranged the boxes carefully inside the wide entry hall, noting how the filtered light from the stained glass transom caught the dust in delicate spirals. The house smelled of wood, old plaster, and faintly of mothballs. It would take time to freshen it, but Sophie didn't mind. Restoring life to such places required patience. 2 hours into the process, the first indication of trouble arrived. Sophie was maneuvering a particularly unwieldy crate through the doorway when she noticed a dark SUV idling at the curb. The vehicle was unfamiliar, sleek, with tinted windows, too polished to belong to one of the older residents. A figure stepped out. A tall woman in her late 50s, immaculately dressed in a cream blazer and tailored slacks. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her expression was one of thinly veiled distaste. Without acknowledging Sophie, the woman retrieved a phone from her purse and began making a call, her eyes fixed on the house. Sophie tried to ignore it. New neighborhoods meant new personalities. Not everyone would be welcoming at first. She returned to her work, though the woman's presence nagged at her. A few minutes later, as Sophie carried another box inside, the sound of sirens cut through the quiet morning. Her pulse quickened. Within moments, a patrol car turned onto Willow Lane, lights flashing. The SUV driver, Karen Draper, as Sophie would soon learn, waved them down with an air of righteous urgency. The officers, 2 in uniform, approached cautiously. Sophie wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped onto the porch to meet them. "Good morning," she said evenly. "Is there a problem?" The senior officer, a tall man with a weathered face and measured tone, glanced between Sophie and Karen. "We received a call reporting suspicious activity. Possible break-in at this address." Sophie blinked. "This is my house. I'm moving in." Karen, now standing beside the officers, interjected sharply. "This property has been vacant for years. The city hasn't finalized anything. I know for a fact that no one should be here. This is highly irregular." Sophie fought to keep her tone calm. "I purchased the house through the city's historic restoration program. The sale closed last week. I have all the paperwork inside." The officers exchanged a glance. Protocol dictated caution. One officer asked to see identification and proof of ownership. Sophie nodded and retrieved the folder from her kitchen counter: deed of sale, confirmation from the city registry, and her driver's license. As they reviewed the documents, Karen's expression darkened. "This must be some mistake," Karen insisted. "I have a printout from the city's public records site. It still lists the property as pending." Sophie knew how outdated those online listings could be. "Public listings lag behind the official records," she said quietly. "The sale is final." The senior officer, Sergeant Julian Benson, arrived minutes later, having been called in due to the nature of the dispute. Known in the community for his fair approach and meticulous attention to detail, Benson took the file, reviewed it carefully, and spoke with the city registry on his radio. Karen hovered nearby, bristling with indignation. "I've lived on this street for 25 years. I have a responsibility to ensure that this neighborhood remains safe and orderly." Sophie suppressed the urge to snap. Instead, she addressed Sergeant Benson directly. "Sergeant, I'm just trying to move into my home." After confirming with the registry that the sale was legitimate, Benson returned the documents to Sophie with a nod. "Everything checks out, ma'am. You're well within your rights. Sorry for the inconvenience." Karen was less placated. "You should at least delay the move until the city updates their records. There are liability concerns." "That's not how property law works," Benson replied evenly. "Mrs. Miller has every right to proceed." Karen's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. Sophie thanked the officers and returned to her work, though the morning's peace had been thoroughly disturbed. As she moved the next crate, she couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning. Indeed, from her peripheral vision, she noticed Karen returning to her SUV and making another call, her face set in grim determination. Sophie sighed. She had expected challenges. An old house came with quirks, after all, but neighborhood politics hadn't been on her list. Still, she reminded herself, she wasn't alone. The law was on her side. She would handle this, one box at a time. The rest of that first afternoon unfolded under an uneasy shadow. Though Sergeant Benson had left with a reassuring nod, and the patrol car had driven off down Willow Lane, Sophie couldn't quite shake the taut feeling in her stomach. The encounter had been resolved politely enough on the surface, but the undercurrents were harder to ignore. Karen Draper had not simply been a nosy neighbor calling in a harmless complaint. There had been venom in her voice, entitlement in the way she'd attempted to dictate the terms of Sophie's move-in, and that lingering glance, the cold gleam in her eyes as she had returned to her SUV, there was no mistaking the warning beneath it. This wasn't over. Sophie wasn't the sort to be easily rattled, but even as she resumed unloading the van, stacking boxes in neat rows in the front parlor, she found herself watching the street with heightened awareness. By late afternoon, with the moving van finally empty and the rental returned, Sophie allowed herself a brief moment of rest. She sat on the wide front steps, sipping water, her muscles pleasantly sore from the day's labor. The house still loomed large with its many unfinished tasks: rooms to clean, utilities to double-check, locks to replace. But progress had been made. Yet even in that small victory, the tension remained. The street seemed quieter than before, almost unnaturally so. A few neighbors had passed by earlier, some offering tentative waves, others simply watching in silence. Word of the morning's incident had undoubtedly spread. As evening approached, Sophie decided to take care of some errands. She needed fresh batteries, cleaning supplies, and groceries, basic provisions for the first few days. Locking up carefully, she drove to the nearby market, keeping her list methodically short. The trip itself was uneventful, but upon her return she was met with a jarring sight. A plain, white notice taped to her front door. Bold type across the top declared it an urgent neighborhood concern. Sophie frowned, peeling the paper free and reading the content. The notice was unsigned, formatted in generic type, and stated that recent suspicious activity at 4-12 Willow Lane had prompted community oversight measures. It further warned that non-compliant renovations or occupancy could result in formal review by appropriate municipal bodies. Sophie's jaw tightened. There was no official seal, no city letterhead. Clearly, this was not an authorized document. A childish, clumsy attempt at intimidation, but unsettling nonetheless. Someone, Karen, had wasted no time escalating the situation. Sophie folded the notice and slid it into a file folder, documenting the incident. If this was going to become a pattern, she would need a proper record. Determined not to appear cowed, Sophie resumed her unpacking, focusing on setting up the kitchen and clearing the main living areas. Evening deepened into night, and though fatigue tugged at her, Sophie forced herself to complete a few more essential tasks. By the time she showered and prepared for bed, the house had begun to feel more hers, less an empty relic, more a space in transition. Yet sleep proved elusive. The house groaned with the natural settling of old wood, every creak magnified by the quiet. And though Sophie knew the source of the unease was external, the sense of vigilance remained. Morning came gray and damp. Sophie's first order of business was securing legal clarity on her position. Though Sergeant Benson had verified her ownership, Sophie understood the value of an added layer of protection. She placed a call to her attorney, Linda Chow, a pragmatic woman with a solid reputation in property and municipal law. Sophie explained the events of the previous day in detail: the false police report, the attempted public shaming, the unauthorized notice. Linda listened carefully and advised immediate steps. File a report with the city regarding the fraudulent notice, notify the property registry of the neighborhood harassment, and, most importantly, do not engage directly with Karen or any provocations. With Linda's counsel in mind, Sophie headed to the municipal offices mid-morning. The clerks at the registry were professional and efficient. The false notice, which Sophie presented as evidence, was duly copied and logged. The city official confirmed what Sophie suspected. No such notice had been sanctioned, and the language was not consistent with any legitimate city document. Moreover, the property records were fully updated. Sophie's ownership was on file and active, her permits and applications properly processed. Reassured by the formality of the process, Sophie thanked the staff and left the building with a little more confidence. Returning to Willow Lane, however, she was greeted by a fresh irritation. Parked at the curb, directly in front of her driveway, was a silver sedan she did not recognize. Behind the wheel sat a man in a windbreaker, sunglasses obscuring his eyes despite the overcast sky. As Sophie pulled in and parked a few spaces down, the man made no move to acknowledge her, nor to leave. He simply sat, engine idling, gaze fixed on the house. Sophie locked her car and approached the porch. The man remained unmoved. Suppressing a flicker of discomfort, Sophie entered the house and called Sergeant Benson's office. The line was answered by his aide, who took note of the situation and promised a patrol would swing by for a welfare check. Within half an hour, a cruiser arrived. The officers spoke briefly with the man, whose responses were not audible from Sophie's vantage point inside. After a short exchange, the man drove off, tires crunching slowly over the wet street. The officers informed Sophie that the individual had claimed to be conducting a property appraisal on behalf of a potential buyer. The explanation was tenuous at best. Sophie had not listed the property for sale, nor had any such inquiry been registered through the proper channels. Now it was clear. The harassment was entering a coordinated phase. Karen was no longer content with passive-aggressive notices or whispered slander. She, or her associates, were taking active steps to create a false narrative around Sophie's presence, that she was not a legitimate owner, that her occupancy was temporary or fraudulent, that the house remained in limbo. The strategy was insidious because it preyed on bureaucratic lag and public perception. If enough uncertainty could be sown, if enough false claims could circulate before official channels caught up, Karen might hope to force Sophie out through sheer attrition. Sophie, however, was not one to fold under pressure. With Linda's guidance, she drafted a formal letter to the local neighborhood association, asserting her legal ownership and putting them on notice regarding the false statements being circulated. A copy was submitted to the city attorney's office as well, along with a request for municipal oversight of the matter. Additionally, Linda contacted the city's public safety liaison, requesting enhanced patrol presence on Willow Lane in light of the escalating pattern of harassment. Meanwhile, Sophie began taking practical precautions. She documented all comings and goings around her property with time-stamped photos. She verified that her utilities were properly registered and fully paid. She secured additional locks for vulnerable entry points and confirmed with her insurance provider that her coverage remained active and fully in force. No drama, no theatrics, just the methodical steps of someone determined to protect her legal rights. Yet for all her careful preparation, the atmosphere on Willow Lane continued to thicken with unease. Neighbors grew more distant. Some crossed the street rather than exchange pleasantries. A few peered from behind curtains when Sophie emerged to retrieve her mail or tend the narrow front garden. The damage of Karen's whispers was evident. The falsehoods had gained traction, and with them came the isolating chill of neighborhood politics. It was late on the third evening, as Sophie was cataloging her workshop tools in the basement, that the next brazen act arrived. The doorbell rang. One long, insistent press. Sophie ascended warily and opened the door to find a courier standing on the porch. He held an envelope marked "Certified, Urgent." The sender, a local law office, unfamiliar to Sophie. Inside, she found a tersely worded letter alleging that her occupancy of the property was under dispute pending review, and demanding a temporary cessation of any renovation activities until the matter was resolved. Sophie's pulse pounded as she read. The letter carried no legal standing, no court order, simply an aggressive bluff dressed in legalese. But the intent was unmistakable: to intimidate, to stall, to force hesitation. Sophie contacted Linda immediately, forwarding the document. Linda's response was swift and unequivocal. Do not comply, document everything, and prepare for a formal rebuttal. As Sophie hung up the phone, exhaustion settled over her, deeper than any physical fatigue. This was no longer just about moving into an old house. It was a campaign, a calculated effort to undermine her presence, her legitimacy, her right to build a home here. And though she had allies, the battle would not be short. Still, resolve took root beneath the weariness. Sophie closed the file on the false legal threat and returned to her unpacking. Let them come. She had the law, the truth, and her own unshakable will on her side, and she would not yield. The days that followed unfolded with a peculiar weight, a slow tightening of the atmosphere around Willow Lane and Sophie's house in particular. Though outwardly calm, Sophie could feel the shape of resistance forming in subtle ways. A glance held too long from a neighbor's window, a conversation abruptly ending when she passed by, a polite nod replaced with tight-lipped silence. The letter from the unknown law office remained on her kitchen counter, a daily reminder of the games being played behind closed doors. Linda had been clear. The letter was meaningless, a fabrication, but the strategy behind it was not. The goal was to sap Sophie's momentum, to cloud the perception of her legal standing, and most critically to isolate her socially within the neighborhood. On the fourth morning, Sophie's phone buzzed with a message from Linda. A city employee from the zoning office had reached out to her. It seemed that someone had anonymously submitted a request for an urgent zoning compliance review on 412 Willow Lane. The claim alleged that Sophie was conducting unpermitted commercial activity within a residential zone, specifically operating a workshop for furniture restoration that might involve hazardous chemicals. The language mirrored the gossip Karen had seeded earlier, but this time it had been elevated to an official inquiry. Though such reviews were routine in cases of actual violations, in this instance it was clearly a weaponized complaint designed to trigger bureaucratic delays and potential fines. Linda's advice was precise. Document everything, do not attempt to communicate with zoning officials alone, and prepare to counter the complaint through the proper channels. Sophie followed the instructions meticulously. She compiled photographs of her workspace, nothing more than a personal hobby room at this stage, with no commercial signage or client traffic. Her use of any chemicals was strictly limited to household-grade materials, far from anything that would trigger environmental concerns. All of it was within the legal allowances for private property use. Still, the complaint was enough to prompt a scheduled site inspection. The inspector, a soft-spoken man named Robert Ames, arrived mid-morning 2 days later. He was courteous and professional, clearly aware that the complaint might be baseless yet duty-bound to conduct the visit. Sophie welcomed him inside, showed him the designated workspace, and provided copies of her property permits and her recent correspondence with the city regarding restoration efforts. The entire process lasted under an hour, and by its end, Robert had assured her that there were no evident violations, that his report would reflect her full compliance. Yet he also hinted, in a tone laced with sympathy, that he had seen similar tactics employed before, neighbors weaponizing zoning codes to harass new arrivals. The encounter reinforced Sophie's sense that she was not simply dealing with petty malice. Karen was orchestrating a layered campaign, one that blended social intimidation with procedural harassment. And the deeper challenge lay in the nature of such tactics. They consumed time, energy, and legal resources, forcing the target to constantly defend ground that should never have been in question. The next escalation arrived less formally, yet carried a sharp sting. Late one afternoon, Sophie noticed a delivery van parked oddly at the curb. The driver, a young man, approached with a clipboard and a large box. "Delivery for 412 Willow Lane," he announced. Puzzled, Sophie accepted the box, though she had ordered nothing of the sort. Inside, she found a bulk shipment of industrial-grade varnish, an expensive, hazardous material unsuitable for household use. Attached was an invoice addressed to Sophie Miller, Commercial Restoration Services. It was a blatant attempt to fabricate evidence for the zoning complaint. Sophie immediately contacted the vendor, explaining the fraudulent order, and ensured that the delivery would be reversed and documented accordingly. Linda was notified as well, and she included this incident in the growing file of coordinated harassment. With each new attempt, the pattern became clearer. The objective was not merely to unsettle Sophie, but to construct a false narrative that could gain traction in the bureaucratic apparatus of the city. Meanwhile, Sergeant Benson remained a steady ally. He had checked in regularly since the initial police report, aware of the neighborhood tensions. When Sophie informed him of the latest developments, including the bogus delivery, he expressed quiet concern. "These tactics," he remarked during one visit, "are designed to make you second-guess your footing. But you're doing everything right. Keep it documented. Keep it legal." He promised increased patrol presence on Willow Lane, particularly during the evenings when the shadows of harassment seemed to lengthen. It was during one such evening patrol that a new layer of the campaign revealed itself. An officer on duty spotted a small group of unfamiliar individuals loitering near the rear alley that bordered Sophie's property. Their vehicle, an unmarked van, bore no commercial logos, yet they appeared to be taking photographs and making notes. When approached, they claimed to be contractors conducting a neighborhood survey. However, they lacked any city-issued permits or identification. The officer detained them briefly for questioning, and though no charges could be pressed, the incident was logged and reported to Sergeant Benson. The implications were clear. Whoever was funding or directing this effort had begun employing third parties, plausibly deniable actors who could feign ignorance if confronted. Karen's reach, it seemed, extended beyond simple neighborhood gossip and into more organized forms of harassment. Sophie, for her part, remained vigilant. Surveillance cameras were installed discreetly around her property, their feeds linked to a secure cloud service. She also began liaising with a local neighborhood watch coordinator, a retired postal inspector named Samuel Greaves, who had witnessed his share of underhanded tactics over the years. Samuel's quiet wisdom proved invaluable, offering both practical advice and moral support. Amidst these escalating tensions, an unexpected opportunity arose. A scheduled meeting of the neighborhood council was announced, a forum where residents could voice concerns and discuss community matters. Initially, Sophie hesitated. Appearing at such a gathering where Karen's influence loomed large could invite further hostility. Yet after consulting with Linda and Sergeant Benson, she resolved to attend, not to confront, but to assert her presence and her rightful place within the community. The evening of the meeting, held in the modest recreation hall at the local park, unfolded with palpable tension. The room was filled with familiar faces, some openly curious, others wary, and a few unmistakably hostile. Karen presided over a portion of the proceedings, her demeanor polished and composed, her words dripping with carefully veiled barbs about preserving the character of Willow Lane. Yet, when the floor was opened for resident comments, Sophie rose to speak. Her statement was measured, rooted in fact and legality. She acknowledged the history of the house, affirmed her legal ownership, and expressed her commitment to respectful restoration in accordance with city guidelines. The impact was subtle yet significant. A murmur rippled through the room. Some faces softened, others exchanged glances. Not all were aligned with Karen's campaign. The simple act of standing and speaking, of refusing to be a faceless target, disrupted the narrative that Karen had worked so carefully to construct. In the days that followed, Sophie noticed a subtle shift. A few neighbors who had previously avoided her now offered brief greetings. The isolation was not entirely broken, but cracks had formed in the wall of suspicion. Yet Karen, true to form, was not deterred. The campaign continued, with new false reports submitted to various municipal departments, claims of noise violations, unpermitted construction, improper waste disposal. Each was methodically countered, documented, and refuted through Linda's diligent efforts. By the end of that week, Sophie's resolve had hardened. The house was not merely a project now. It had become a symbol of her right to stand her ground. The weight of the harassment was real, draining in its relentlessness, but it had also forged a deeper determination. And with each failed attempt to dislodge her, Karen's campaign began to reveal its own desperation. The battle for Willow Lane was far from over, but Sophie was no longer merely reacting. She was building her defense, gathering her allies, and preparing for whatever escalation might come next. The house, with its weathered walls and creaking floors, seemed to echo her resolve. A place with a past, now determined to claim its future. In the weeks that followed, the tempo of the conflict subtly shifted. The flurry of petty complaints and anonymous reports, while still present, gave way to a more calculated strategy. It was no longer about moment-to-moment harassment, but about sowing a broader narrative, one that might eventually entangle Sophie in a web of legal ambiguity and social suspicion. Linda, ever perceptive, warned her during one of their calls that this was a classic pivot in harassment tactics. When the aggressor realized that immediate pressure was insufficient to force capitulation, they often sought to entrench a longer-term narrative, that the target was an unwelcome presence, their ownership somehow flawed or vulnerable. The key now, Linda advised, was not merely to rebut each incident, but to anticipate the broader pattern and proactively reinforce Sophie's legal and social position. To that end, Sophie began working closely with both Linda and Sergeant Benson on a more structured approach. Linda drafted a formal legal memorandum detailing the cumulative pattern of harassment, complete with timelines, incident reports, and supporting documentation. This memorandum was submitted to the city attorney's office with a request for oversight, ensuring that any future complaints against Sophie's property would be cross-referenced with the growing file of bad faith actions. Simultaneously, Sergeant Benson initiated an internal review of the initial police report and subsequent calls involving Sophie's address, flagging the false nature of the original complaint for departmental awareness. These measures provided a subtle but critical shield, one that would make future weaponized complaints more transparent to city officials. Yet, while the legal groundwork was being laid, the social terrain remained treacherous. Karen's influence among certain circles in the neighborhood remained strong. At the next neighborhood council gathering, for instance, Karen skillfully redirected conversations about community initiatives into veiled critiques of unauthorized commercial activities and changes to the character of Willow Lane. Though she never mentioned Sophie by name, the target was obvious. Sophie attended the meeting again, her presence calm but firm, speaking when appropriate and countering misinformation with facts. Still, the atmosphere was charged, the divide among the residents growing more pronounced. It was during this tense period that an unexpected event shifted the balance. One morning, Sophie received a notice from her insurance provider. A routine annual verification of property use had been triggered by an external inquiry. The inquiry, as it turned out, had been submitted anonymously through an online tip portal, alleging that Sophie's property was being used for hazardous industrial purposes. The language mirrored earlier zoning complaints but carried a new risk. If the insurance provider accepted the claim at face value, her policy could be suspended, exposing her to significant financial liability. Upon receiving the notice, Sophie acted swiftly. She contacted her insurance agent directly, providing comprehensive documentation of her property's actual use and offering to facilitate an immediate on-site verification. Simultaneously, Linda prepared a legal notice to the insurance company, warning of the coordinated harassment campaign and advising against any action based on unverified anonymous claims. Within days, the matter was resolved in Sophie's favor, her policy reaffirmed, and the inquiry dismissed as baseless. Yet the episode served as a stark reminder. The campaign against her was evolving, probing for new angles of attack. Amidst this turbulence, a new ally emerged from an unexpected quarter. Samuel Greaves, the retired postal inspector who had quietly advised Sophie, reached out with news. Through informal conversations with his former colleagues and local contacts, he had traced certain patterns in the anonymous reports and mailings associated with Sophie's address. While not definitive proof, the timing and language of the submission strongly suggested coordination originating from within a small circle of neighborhood figures, Karen's inner cadre. Moreover, Samuel had uncovered evidence that one of the so-called independent survey contractors, who had previously trespassed near Sophie's property, had connections to a private security firm known for conducting dubious background checks and property investigations on behalf of affluent clients. Armed with this information, Sophie and Linda prepared a more robust legal strategy. Linda filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, citing potential violations of anti-harassment statutes and misuse of private investigative services. The complaint, while unlikely to trigger immediate prosecution, served as a clear warning. The scope of legal scrutiny was widening, and those behind the harassment would no longer operate in the shadows without consequence. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her methodical restoration of the house. Each completed project, a repaired section of the porch railing, a freshly painted window frame, a restored brass fixture, reinforced her sense of place, a tangible assertion of her right to be there. Yet, even amidst the progress, vigilance remained necessary. One evening, while organizing supplies in the backyard, Sophie noticed a small electronic device affixed to the base of the fence. an audio recorder, crudely concealed. It was swiftly removed and documented, another entry in the growing file of intrusive actions. The discovery of the device marked a turning point. Sergeant Benson, upon reviewing the evidence, initiated a targeted investigation. While conclusive attribution remained challenging, the cumulative pattern of incidents, false reports, coordinated complaints, unauthorized surveillance, had now crossed into territory that warranted active law enforcement intervention. Benson's message to Sophie was clear. The city's patience with Karen's campaign was waning. Yet in this moment of rising institutional support, Sophie faced a more personal test. A scheduled open house for the city's historic restoration program was to be held that month, with participants invited to showcase their progress and share experiences with prospective applicants. Sophie's property, given its prominence and the quality of her work, was selected for inclusion. The prospect of opening her home to public viewing amidst ongoing harassment posed obvious risks. But after careful deliberation with Linda, Sergeant Benson, and Samuel, Sophie chose to proceed. The event would not only affirm her legitimate presence but also serve to counter the false narratives circulating in the community. The open house, conducted under discreet police observation, unfolded without incident. Visitors, city officials, fellow restoration enthusiasts, and a smattering of curious neighbors toured the house, engaged with Sophie, and witnessed firsthand the care and authenticity of her efforts. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, a subtle yet powerful rebuttal to the smear campaign. Even some of the more skeptical neighbors, seeing the tangible results, began to reassess their assumptions. For Karen, however, the event marked a visible setback. Her influence, while still formidable, had suffered a public blow. The narrative of Sophie as an illegitimate outsider had begun to unravel, replaced by a more grounded reality of a dedicated homeowner contributing to the neighborhood's heritage. Yet Karen's pride, deeply entwined with her perceived authority over Willow Lane, would not yield so easily. The stage was set for further escalation, a final bid to reclaim control, even at the risk of exposing her own culpability. As Sophie locked up the house that evening, exhaustion gave way to a tempered resolve. The battle for legitimacy had reached its midpoint. The path ahead remained fraught, but with each confrontation, each small victory, the ground beneath her feet grew firmer. And though the shadows of opposition still lingered, the light of truth and lawful perseverance had begun to pierce through. The aftermath of the open house left a curious stillness in its wake, as though the air itself was holding its breath. In the days that followed, Sophie found the neighborhood oddly subdued. The usual glances from certain windows became less frequent. Conversations in the park seemed to quiet when she passed. It was a surface calm, but not one born of resolution. Rather, it was the tense lull before a storm, the retreat of an opponent regrouping behind the scenes. Karen's campaign had suffered a public wound. The open house had undercut her narrative, forcing some of her allies to reevaluate their positions. Yet if Sophie had learned anything from these past months, it was that Karen Draper would not surrender her influence so easily. The woman's pride was too deeply invested, her sense of control over Willow Lane too entrenched, and indeed the next phase of the conflict would soon reveal itself, more aggressive, more calculated, and with stakes raised beyond anything Sophie had yet encountered. The first sign came in the form of a registered letter delivered to Sophie's mailbox. The envelope, stamped with the insignia of a well-known regional law firm, contained a formal notice of intent to pursue civil action. The allegations were sweeping: public nuisance, endangerment of community welfare, violation of historic preservation guidelines, and illegal commercial activity. The document was dense with legal jargon, its tone aggressive and accusatory, but its core intent was clear: to drag Sophie into a protracted legal battle that could drain her resources and wear down her resolve. Linda, upon reviewing the letter, quickly identified its weaknesses. The claims were largely unfounded, many easily disproven. Yet the strategy was insidious. By initiating formal proceedings, even on shaky grounds, Karen's camp could force Sophie to divert time, energy, and money toward legal defense, sowing doubt in public perception and potentially influencing city oversight bodies. Simultaneously, a new front opened in the social sphere. Karen and her inner circle began circulating a community petition, calling for enhanced oversight of historic properties on Willow Lane. The petition, cloaked in the language of civic responsibility, was in truth a thinly veiled attack on Sophie's project. Rumors swirled that the petition was being pushed aggressively, with certain neighbors pressured to sign under the implicit threat of social exclusion. Word reached Sophie through Samuel Greaves and a few sympathetic residents who quietly refused to support the initiative. The petition itself carried no legal force but served as a tool of social coercion, a means to further isolate Sophie and paint her as a disruptive outsider. Yet the most troubling development came not through legal channels or social maneuvering but through a direct assault on Sophie's sense of safety. Late one evening, as she reviewed renovation plans in her study, a loud crash echoed from the front porch. Heart-pounding, Sophie rushed to the door, phone in hand, ready to call for help. On the porch lay a shattered planter, its contents strewn across the steps. Nearby, a brick wrapped in paper bore a crude message. "You don't belong here." The act was brazen, meant to intimidate. Sophie immediately contacted Sergeant Benson, who dispatched officers to document the incident. The brick was collected for evidence, fingerprints taken, though the likelihood of conclusive forensic results was slim. Still, the attack marked a dangerous escalation, an attempt to push the conflict from legal and social realms into one of personal threat. Linda, ever strategic, advised doubling down on legal protections. Temporary security measures were enhanced around the property, and a formal restraining order was filed against any unauthorized harassment or trespass. Meanwhile, Sergeant Benson intensified patrols in the area, making a visible law enforcement presence known on Willow Lane. The move served both to deter further acts of vandalism and to signal institutional support for Sophie's position. Karen's response was swift and telling. Within days, a new complaint was lodged with the city's Code Enforcement Office, alleging a series of fabricated violations on Sophie's property: improper waste disposal, unsafe electrical work, unauthorized structural alterations. The complaint triggered yet another mandatory inspection, though by now city officials were increasingly aware of the broader context. The inspector assigned to the case conducted his review professionally and with evident sympathy for Sophie's situation. His report found no violations, and in a private conversation, he acknowledged the clear pattern of harassment emerging from certain quarters of the neighborhood. Yet even as institutional allies solidified, the psychological toll on Sophie mounted. The constant vigilance, the unending stream of petty aggressions and legal threats, the social isolation, each took its toll. There were nights when sleep eluded her, when the creak of old floorboards or the hum of distant voices outside stirred a visceral tension. Yet, through it all, Sophie's resolve held firm. The house, for all its age and imperfections, had become more than a project. It was a symbol of her right to stand her ground, a testament to perseverance in the face of orchestrated malice. Support from unexpected quarters also began to emerge. A small but growing number of neighbors, previously silent, began to offer quiet words of encouragement. A kind nod, a brief conversation in passing, an offer of assistance with a repair. The open house had shifted perceptions. Seeing Sophie's dedication and the tangible improvements to the property had humanized her in ways that rumor and innuendo could not easily counter. Karen's narrative, while still potent among her core supporters, no longer commanded universal assent. Amidst these evolving dynamics, a pivotal moment arrived. Sophie received notice that her project had been selected for recognition in the city's annual Preservation Awards, a prestigious acknowledgement of excellence in historic restoration. The announcement, published in the local media, brought a surge of public validation. For Karen, it was a public relations disaster. The very house she had sought to cast as a blight was now celebrated as a model of civic engagement and preservation. Predictably, the response from Karen's camp was swift and venomous. A new legal maneuver emerged, a motion for an injunction seeking to halt all further work on the property pending resolution of the civil action. The motion, though legally dubious, carried the potential to disrupt Sophie's progress and further strain her resources. Linda prepared an aggressive counter-motion, marshalling evidence of the pattern of bad faith litigation and the frivolous nature of the claims. Simultaneously, public support for Sophie surged, with letters of endorsement from preservation societies, city officials, and community members submitted to the court. The hearing on the injunction proved a watershed moment. In a packed courtroom, with media quietly observing from the gallery, both sides presented their arguments. Linda's presentation was masterful, calm, methodical, and richly supported by documentation. She outlined the timeline of harassment, the baseless nature of the claims, the broader context of Karen's campaign. The opposing counsel, while polished, struggled to counter the weight of evidence. The judge, a seasoned jurist with little patience for frivolous litigation, ultimately denied the motion, citing insufficient grounds and clear indications of harassment. The ruling sent a ripple through the community. Karen's aura of untouchable authority was visibly shaken. Allies who had once deferred to her leadership now hesitated, their confidence eroded. For Sophie, the victory was both legal and psychological. It affirmed her standing, reinforced her legitimacy, and underscored the futility of Karen's escalating tactics. Yet in victory lay new risks. Karen, her pride wounded, was unlikely to retreat gracefully. The potential for further escalation remained high, perhaps even extending into more desperate or reckless actions. Linda and Sergeant Benson counseled vigilance, emphasizing that while the legal tide had turned, personal safety remained paramount. As Sophie returned home from the courthouse that evening, a sense of hard-earned clarity settled over her. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. The house, once a battleground of contested narratives, now stood as a beacon of perseverance and rightful ownership. The community, fractured though it remained, had begun to see through the veil of manufactured dissent, and Sophie herself, tempered by months of unrelenting pressure, had emerged not diminished, but strengthened, ready to face whatever final gambits her opponents might yet play. The weeks following the court's decision denying the injunction brought an uneasy sense of progress. On the surface, the tide appeared to have turned decisively in Sophie's favor. The legal standing of her ownership was now reinforced by both judicial ruling and public validation. The Preservation Award, widely publicized, had reshaped the narrative of her presence on Willow Lane. The overt campaigns of harassment slowed, their previous intensity diminished as Karen's influence visibly eroded. Yet, beneath this apparent calm, Sophie sensed a deeper tension coiling, a final, desperate undercurrent in Karen's campaign. For someone who had wielded near unquestioned authority within the neighborhood for so long, public humiliation and legal defeat were bitter pills. Pride, wounded and cornered, rarely yielded gracefully. Sophie remained vigilant. The house, steadily transforming under her careful hand, now reflected both her personal vision and a quiet defiance against the campaign waged to expel her. Security measures remained in place, her legal file meticulously updated with each new development, however minor. Linda continued to monitor potential legal retaliations, while Sergeant Benson maintained an open line of communication, aware that the most dangerous moments often followed apparent defeat. It was on a damp, slate-gray morning that the next act unfolded. Sophie awoke to the sound of a movement outside, unusual for the early hour. Peering through the curtains, she saw a cluster of vehicles idling at the curb. A white van with municipal markings, a sedan belonging to the city's code enforcement office, and, incongruously, Karen's distinctive SUV. A small group of uniformed workers and suited officials stood conversing animatedly near the sidewalk, clipboards in hand. The scene had the orchestrated air of an ambush veiled as official business. Before Sophie could fully process the tableau, there was a sharp knock at the door. Opening it cautiously, she was greeted by a stern-faced man identifying himself as the acting deputy of the city's Environmental Compliance Division. He presented a document, a temporary abatement order issued that very morning, citing an anonymous report of hazardous material storage on the premises. The order, while lacking full judicial review, authorized an immediate inspection and potential seizure of offending materials under emergency municipal protocols. Sophie's heart pounded. The maneuver was audacious, an attempt to bypass the legal stalemate by invoking public safety statutes. Linda's voice echoed in her mind. Document everything. Never consent without verification. Keeping her tone calm, Sophie requested to see the full warrant and identification for all present. Simultaneously, she placed a call to Linda. Her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Within minutes, Linda was on speakerphone, challenging the validity of the order and demanding clarification of its expedited issuance. Sergeant Benson, alerted by Sophie's earlier message, arrived shortly thereafter, his presence injecting a sharp note of scrutiny into the proceedings. The assembled officials, under his measured questioning, began to falter in their justifications. The abatement order, it emerged, had been pushed through via an emergency request filed late the previous evening, based entirely on an unsigned complaint supported by fabricated photographic evidence submitted through an anonymous tip portal. The unraveling was swift and damning. Under Benson's directive, the inspection was halted pending full legal review. The officials, some visibly uncomfortable, retreated. Their earlier confidence evaporated. Karen, lingering near her SUV, watched the scene with a pallid expression, the thin veneer of righteous indignation cracking under the weight of public exposure. Benson, maintaining professional composure, approached her with deliberate purpose. In a voice carrying to those assembled, he outlined the improprieties of the morning's events and advised her in no uncertain terms that any further attempts to subvert legal process would prompt formal criminal investigation. But the true culmination came not in that moment of confrontation, but in the formal channels that followed. Linda, armed with the full documentation of the attempted abuse of emergency protocols, filed an immediate complaint with the city's Oversight Commission. Simultaneously, Sergeant Benson submitted a detailed report to the district attorney's office, highlighting the pattern of coordinated harassment, falsified evidence, and misuse of municipal resources. The city's response was swift and unequivocal. A formal hearing was scheduled, summoning all parties involved in the morning's aborted inspection, including Karen. The hearing, conducted under the auspices of the Municipal Ethics Committee, drew considerable attention. For the first time, the full scope of the harassment campaign was presented in an official forum, its cumulative weight impossible to ignore. Karen's defense, constructed hastily by her legal team, crumbled under scrutiny. The anonymous tip submissions were traced to a series of accounts linked to her household network. The falsified photographs bore metadata tying them to her personal devices. Witness testimony, including statements from sympathetic neighbors and city officials aware of the broader context, painted a damning portrait of her actions. The committee's findings were unambiguous. Karen was formally censured for abuse of municipal processes, with referrals made to both civil and potential criminal proceedings. Moreover, the city issued a public statement reaffirming Sophie's legal standing and condemning the campaign of harassment conducted against her. The hearing's conclusion reverberated through the neighborhood. The aura of fear and control that Karen had cultivated for years shattered in a single, public reckoning. Her allies, already wavering, distanced themselves swiftly. Social invitations evaporated. Whispers of her misconduct replaced the deference she once commanded. For Sophie, the moment carried a profound, if sober, sense of resolution. The house, once a contested battleground, now stood firmly within her rightful domain. The community, its divisions laid bare, began a slow process of realignment. with voices of reason and respect emerging to fill the vacuum left by Karen's fall. Yet the final act remained, an act not of legal triumph but of moral closure. Under the terms negotiated by Linda and city officials, and to avoid immediate escalation to criminal trial, Karen was required to issue a formal public apology. The venue was to be Sophie's front lawn, the site where the original false police report had initiated the long chain of events. The day of the apology dawned bright, an unseasonably clear morning. A modest gathering assembled: neighbors, city officials, members of the preservation community, and media representatives. Sophie stood calmly on her porch, flanked by Linda and Sergeant Benson. Karen, drawn and visibly diminished, arrived accompanied by her attorney. The statement, prepared in advance and reviewed by legal counsel, was read in a strained voice. Its words of contrition delivered with the brittle edge of a woman forced to confront the consequences of her own hubris. The moment was not one of triumphalism for Sophie, but of quiet vindication. As the final words of apology faded into the still morning air, she felt the weight of the long struggle begin to lift. The house, her house, stood in the background, a testament not only to the endurance of brick and timber but to the resilience of rightful purpose against manufactured dissent. As the crowd dispersed and the media cameras lowered, Sergeant Benson offered a quiet word of acknowledgement. "You stood your ground, Miss Miller, and you did it the right way." Sophie met his gaze, her voice steady, because there was never any other way worth taking. The battle for Willow Lane had reached its culmination, not with spectacle or vengeance, but with the firm, unwavering assertion of truth over falsehood, of lawful right over manipulative pride. And in that, Sophie found not just victory, but peace. In the weeks that followed the public apology, life on Willow Lane began to settle into a quieter rhythm, one marked less by the undercurrents of conflict and more by the slow, deliberate process of healing. The spectacle of that morning, the gathering of neighbors and officials, the cameras, the strained contrition in Karen's voice, had left an undeniable mark on the community. Word of the events traveled quickly beyond the street, rippling through local circles, prompting discussions in council meetings and preservation forums alike. The narrative that had once painted Sophie as an interloper had been irrevocably dismantled, replaced by the clear public acknowledgement of her rightful standing. Yet for Sophie, the resolution brought not triumph but a tempered, thoughtful sense of closure. She had never sought to conquer her neighbors, never aimed for dominance or spectacle. Her fight had been one of necessity, a defense of dignity and legality in the face of relentless provocation. Now, with the formal apology delivered and the legal machinery finally quieted, her focus returned fully to the work she had begun so many months before, the restoration of a house, and with it, the quiet rebuilding of community ties. The transformation of the property itself stood as a visible testament to that perseverance. The once faded facade gleamed with fresh paint, its intricate woodwork carefully restored by Sophie's skilled hands. The porch railings, now straight and solid, framed a welcoming entryway where neighbors once feared to tread. Within, the home had come alive. Warm tones of polished wood, light filtering through cleaned and repaired stained glass, the scent of aged oak mingling with subtle traces of lavender and beeswax. What had once been derided as a blight was now a point of pride for the street, its revival sparking interest from preservation groups and architecture enthusiasts alike. In the social fabric of the neighborhood, shifts were equally apparent. The wary glances and tight-lipped silences that had once greeted Sophie's presence gave way, gradually, to tentative conversations, to nods of acknowledgement, to the first genuine invitations for coffee or neighborhood events. Samuel Greaves remained a steady ally, his quiet wisdom invaluable in navigating the delicate reweaving of communal ties. Through him, Sophie connected with a small but sincere circle of residents who valued her dedication and the integrity of her work. Karen, for her part, retreated from public life on Willow Lane. The formal censure and the threat of further legal consequences cast a long shadow over her once formidable presence. Her participation in community functions dwindled. Her influence among former allies diminished to whispers and reluctant courtesies. The transformation was not one of vengeance, but of consequence, an organic result of her own choices and their public unmasking. For Sophie, the greatest reward lay not in Karen's fall, but in the reclamation of her own peace. Freed from the constant specter of litigation and harassment, she immersed herself in her restoration work with renewed focus. The house had always been a labor of love, its revival a dialogue with history and craft. Now it also embodied resilience, a sanctuary not only of wood and stone but of earned stability and community standing. In the months that followed, Sophie hosted a modest open evening for the neighborhood. Not a grand event, but a simple gathering to share the home's progress and foster goodwill. The turnout was quiet but genuine, with several neighbors expressing appreciation for the transformation, for the patience and dignity with which Sophie had weathered the long conflict. Among them were even a few faces once counted among Karen's orbit, proof that time and integrity could soften old divides. The city's Preservation Society, recognizing Sophie's work and the broader implications of her experience, invited her to speak at an upcoming forum on property rights and community relations in historic districts. It was an opportunity she accepted thoughtfully, not out of vanity, but from a sense of responsibility, to share what she had learned, to offer guidance for others who might one day face similar challenges. Through it all, Sophie remained grounded. The battles fought and won had shaped her, instilling a deeper appreciation for the fragile balance between personal rights and communal dynamics. Yet she had never lost sight of her core purpose: to restore a home, to honor its history, and to build a life rooted in respect and quiet contribution. And so, as the seasons turned and the first hints of spring softened the edges of winter, life on Willow Lane began anew. The house stood proudly amidst budding trees and fresh blooms, a beacon of perseverance and rightful belonging. Sophie, content in her work and her place, moved forward, not in the shadow of past conflicts, but in the clear light of a future shaped by patience, integrity, and unshakable resolve.